is here again. Today we are making pizza. Pizza is delightful. I'm also going to give you some tips on making a nice complimentary salad to go with it. And if you wanted to make breadsticks or a nice cheese bread or garlic bread, I'll give you some tips on that as well. To start with though, we need to make the pizza dough. Now a couple things about making pizza dough. You have several options. You can absolutely make the dough and make your pizza right off the bat without letting it truly rest in proof. If you do that, your crust will be a little bit denser, a little bit heavier. That's totally fine. A lot of people like the texture of that, especially if you're wanting to do a really thin crust. That's totally fine. You do not have to wait. If you have time, however, to allow your dough to proof for a good 45 minutes to an hour, that will give you a much easier dough to work with because it will give it more elasticity. It'll be able to stretch easier when you want to roll it out and put it on your pan. So my recommendation would be to allow yourself 45 minutes to an hour to let the dough rest after it's been made. All right, so getting started, first I want to talk about yeast. When you work with yeast, there are several different kinds of yeast that you can buy in the store. Mostly the difference is packaging. Sometimes it's sold in these strips of packets, sometimes it's sold in a jar or a large bag. All of these are dry yeast that have been preserved, which means that the life cycle of the yeast has been paused. Yeast is a living organism, and so when you buy dry yeast, somebody has preserved that so that it can be kept for quite a while. When we add it to water, it brings it back to life so that it can grow and give us a nice lift in our bread or our pizza dough, whatever we're making with it. The biggest difference between the two main kinds of yeast are something that we'll say quick or rapid or fast rising, and just traditional active dry. This is a traditional yeast, which means it needs to go into warm water, not cold because it won't thrive, and not hot because it will die if it's too hot. But nice warm water will unpause the life cycle so it can come to life. This is called proofing. You would let it sit in the water for about 5 minutes so that it can come back to life, and then you're good to go. A quick or rapid or fast rise yeast means that you can literally add this yeast in with your flour to whatever you're making and it will do its job. So if you can find a quick or a rapid rise yeast, it's a little easier to work with. It also requires less proofing time later on. So if you wanted to let your dough rest to make some pizza dough ahead of time, you would only need to let it proof for maybe 20-30 minutes and it will rise a little bit quicker. The difference between that and an active yeast is that sometimes a quick yeast is not as stable, which means if you're making a bread, sometimes your bread will not be quite as stable after it's risen and maybe fall if it's handled too much. But in pizza dough, it really doesn't make a huge difference. I personally usually go with active dry unless I'm in a really big hurry, or this is what I can find, I'll do the quick. So I'm just going to use a traditional yeast today so that I can show you how to proof. So 1 packet of yeast is what we're using. If you have yeast that's in a jar or a bag, it's 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. That's how much is in one of these little packets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour this yeast into my mixing bowl, just like that. And then I have 1 cup of warm water. I say if you could comfortably wash your hands in it and not feel like, ooh, that's really hot, or ooh, that's really cold, then it's probably fine. So I'm gonna pour that in there. I'm gonna give it just a little stir, just to make sure all of the yeast granules are wet, and then let it set for a few minutes, okay? All right, so we've let the yeast rest for a few minutes. It's gotten nice and foamy and bubbly. If you're using a quick or a rapid yeast, it's less likely to foam and bubble just because it's preserved differently. Don't stress. As long as your yeast isn't expired, it should be functioning just fine. So I have my nice foamy yeast here, and to this I'm gonna add 1 teaspoon of sugar. You could use granulated sugar, brown sugar, cane sugar, honey, just something that has that little bit of sweetness 1 teaspoon is not going to make our dough sweet. All it's doing is feeding the yeast. Because yeast is a living organism, it needs something to digest so that it can thrive. So 1 teaspoon of sugar is just going to give it something to munch on as it develops, okay? And then we're also going to add 3 tablespoons of oil. Oil in dough is going to give us a little bit more softness to the finished product. It's also going to help with the elasticity when we go to knead the dough. You definitely can omit the oil in this or use melted butter. If you leave out all oil or butter, you will have a more crisp type texture. It won't be quite as soft and chewy, okay? All right, so then the last 2 things we have to add are flour and salt. Now, anytime you are working with yeast, yeast is very delicate. That's why we need a very specific temperature of water. It needs some sugar so that it can digest. And then salt, because salt is abrasive, we never want to add salt directly into a yeast bath here because salt can potentially harm the development of the yeast and cause it to not grow. And so what we want to do is add a little bit of our flour and then we'll add our salt in because the flour will give us a protective barrier between the yeast and the salt, okay? So I'm going to grab something to stir with. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add 1 cup of flour. Now, anytime you're measuring flour, you want to make sure you keep it nice, light, and fluffy. We don't ever want to pack. So if you take your scoop and you shove it down into your container, you're compacting all of that flour down in there and you're going to end up with too much by weight. So my recommendation would be either to take a second measuring cup and sprinkle your flour in. This is called sifting. Or you can do a shuffle scoop, which is where you take your scoop and put it in sideways and you do short sideways motions to fill your measuring cup and then tip it so it's right side up once you've shuffled some into there. That keeps it nice, light, and fluffy without having to use a second measuring container. So I'm just gonna add 1 cup to start with. There's 1 cup. And then I'm just gonna give it a little stir just to somewhat combine. It's not fully going to incorporate at this point. It's just gonna look lumpy and soupy. That's totally fine. Pockets of some flour there, no big deal. Okay. Then there we go. My oven was letting me know it was preheated. All right, I'm going to add my salt now, and we're only adding 1 teaspoon of salt. Again, because I've added that 1 cup of flour, I've kind of created a protective barrier between the yeast and the salt so that it can still continue to thrive. Give that a little stir so that salt's incorporated. And then I'm gonna add the rest of my flour. So I'm gonna add 2.5 cups of flour. Again, making sure that I'm shuffling, keeping it nice, light, and airy so it's not compacted. Adding that extra 1.5 cups. So at this point, I have a total of 2.5 cups of flour in my bowl. Total 2.5. Okay, now, anytime you're working with yeast and flour, depending on how accurate your scoops are, you may need slightly more than what I've added here, or you may need even less. That's why sometimes it's good to add maybe 1/2 cup at a time if you're not sure if you're measuring accurately, because we don't want to add too much and cause our dough to be too dry. We want a nice workable dough without being overly wet, okay? So I'm going to show you after 2.5 cups what mine looks like. It's nice and shaggy. Oh, you can hear. There's an airplane going over my house. My dough is nice and shaggy here. A little bit sticky in spots, that's totally fine. We're gonna finish kneading this on the counter before we let it rise. What I'm going to do, I'm gonna do a light sprinkle of flour on the counter, just like that. And then I'm going to dump this dough out right on top of there, okay? If it's really sticky to touch still, you can sprinkle some more flour on top. Your dough should not be soupy. It should be pulling together into a fairly decent ball at this point. Tacky in some places, but it should be one unit. If it still looks soupy, it needs a little more flour in your bowl because you don't want a soupy mess on your counter. All right, so to finish kneading, what we're going to do is we're gonna make a nice long rectangle in front of us, and then we're gonna take one end and fold it over in half and then push down, okay? Then make a rectangle again, take one end, fold it over, push down. This is called folding. You can turn it to the side and make a rectangle the other direction. Push down. We're just gonna keep doing that until our dough moves into a nice tight ball and springs back when we poke it. That means when I pick this up and I poke it with my finger, that indent that I've made should spring back and fill back in and disappear. If you poke your dough and it leaves a crater, it does not fill back in, then you need to knead it for a few more minutes, okay? All right. Now this batch of dough will make one large pizza or 2 to 3 personal size pizzas. So if you have a larger family and you need to feed more people, I would definitely recommend doubling this recipe, okay? All right, so once my dough is nice and smooth, it's a little bit tacky in some places, but it's not coming off onto my hands. It springs back when I poke it. I know that it's ready, and I'm gonna go ahead and let it rest. So I'm gonna put it back into its bowl. I'm gonna loosely cover this with either a piece of saran wrap or foil or a towel and let it rest for about 45 minutes before I work it into pizza crust.